The stench hit them first. It was November 17, 1558, and the servants approaching Queen Mary Tudor's bedchamber at St. James's Palace had to steel themselves before entering. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. England's first crowned Queen Regnant, the woman who had burned nearly 300 Protestant heretics at the stake, lay dying in agony. Her once pale skin had turned a sickly black, her body swollen beyond recognition, and a putrid odor emanated from her very pores. This was not how a queen was supposed to die. Mary I, known to history as Bloody Mary, was experiencing a death so grotesque, so utterly horrifying, that witnesses would later whisper it was divine retribution for her reign of terror. But the truth behind her blackened, rotting demise reveals a story far more complex and infinitely more tragic than simple divine justice. This is the story of how England's most controversial queen met her end, and why the manner of her death became as infamous as the fires she lit during her 5-year reign. To understand Mary's horrific final days, we must first examine the cruel deception that shattered her world just 3 years earlier. In 1555, at the age of 39, Queen Mary Tudor believed she was carrying the heir that would secure both her throne and the Catholic restoration she had fought so desperately to achieve. For months, Mary exhibited every sign of pregnancy. Her belly swelled, she experienced morning sickness, and her physicians confirmed what the Queen desperately wanted to hear. England prepared for the birth of a Catholic prince or princess who would continue Mary's holy mission. Cradles were prepared, wet nurses were selected, and the Queen retreated to her chambers for the traditional confinement period. But as the months dragged on, something was terribly wrong. Mary's pregnancy stretched far beyond the normal 9 months. Her stomach remained distended, but no child came. Court physicians grew increasingly nervous, whispering among themselves about the Queen's condition. Some brave souls suggested that perhaps Her Majesty had been mistaken about her condition, but such words were tantamount to treason. The truth was both tragic and humiliating. Mary was not pregnant. She never had been. Modern medical experts believe Mary was likely suffering from a phantom pregnancy, a condition where a woman's desperate desire for a child manifests in physical symptoms that perfectly mimic actual pregnancy. For Mary, who had endured years of stress, irregular menstrual cycles, and the crushing pressure to produce an heir, her body had betrayed her in the cruelest possible way. The psychological devastation was complete. When Mary finally emerged from her chambers, her hair had turned prematurely gray, and those who knew her best reported that something fundamental had broken inside the Queen. The woman who had once been described as having a sweet and noble disposition had hardened into something else entirely, something desperate and dangerous. This false pregnancy would prove to be the beginning of the end for Mary Tudor. But it was also the catalyst for the increasingly erratic behavior and deteriorating health that would ultimately lead to her grotesque demise. Following the humiliation of her phantom pregnancy, Mary Tudor's health began a steady decline that those close to her could not ignore. But this wasn't merely the natural aging process. This was stress literally eating the Queen alive from the inside out. The pressures facing Mary were unprecedented in English royal history. She was the first woman to rule England in her own right, fighting daily to maintain her authority in a world that believed women were inherently unfit to govern. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was both politically necessary and personally unfulfilling. Philip spent most of his time abroad, leaving Mary isolated and increasingly paranoid about threats to her crown. But perhaps most crushing of all was the religious war she was waging against her own people. Mary's campaign to restore Catholicism to England had devolved into a reign of terror that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestant heretics were burned at the stake on her orders. Each execution was meant to terrify the population into submission, but instead, it only increased resistance to her rule. The psychological toll of ordering these deaths, of watching men, women, and even children burn alive for their faith, cannot be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe Mary as becoming increasingly withdrawn, prone to fits of rage, and obsessed with the idea that God was testing her resolve. She would spend hours in prayer, begging for forgiveness while simultaneously ordering more executions. Court physicians began to notice alarming changes in the Queen's physical condition. She complained constantly of headaches so severe they left her bedridden for days. Her appetite disappeared almost entirely, and she lost a dangerous amount of weight. Most disturbing of all, she began experiencing episodes where her vision would blur and she would temporarily lose consciousness. Modern medical experts believe Mary was likely suffering from what we now recognize as chronic stress disorder, possibly complicated by an underlying autoimmune condition. The constant psychological pressure was literally destroying her body's ability to function normally. But Mary refused to rest, refused to delegate, and refused to acknowledge that her body was failing. She believed that any sign of weakness would be seen as divine disapproval of her holy mission. So she pushed forward, driving herself harder and harder, even as those around her watched in horror as their queen slowly disintegrated before their eyes. The stage was being set for a death unlike any in English royal history. By the summer of 1558, Mary Tudor's physical deterioration had accelerated beyond anything her physicians had ever witnessed. The Queen, who had once been described as having a pleasant and cheerful countenance, was now gaunt, hollow-eyed, and increasingly erratic in her behavior. The first truly alarming symptom appeared in July. Mary began experiencing severe abdominal pain that would double her over without warning. Initially, her doctors dismissed these episodes as women's troubles, or perhaps the lingering effects of her phantom pregnancy. But the pain grew worse, not better, and it was accompanied by symptoms that baffled the medical understanding of the time. Mary's skin began to change color. It started subtly, a yellowish tint that court ladies tried to cover with powder and rouge. But within weeks, the discoloration had deepened to an alarming brown, and by early autumn, patches of her skin had turned nearly black. The transformation was so dramatic that foreign ambassadors who hadn't seen the Queen in months barely recognized her when she appeared at court. Even more disturbing was the smell. Those close to Mary reported that she had developed a distinctly unpleasant odor that seemed to emanate from her very pores. It wasn't the normal scent of unwashed bodies that was common in the 16th century. This was something else entirely, something that made people unconsciously step back when the Queen entered a room. Modern medical experts believe Mary was likely suffering from liver failure, possibly caused by autoimmune hepatitis or another condition that caused her liver to shut down gradually. This would explain both the dramatic skin discoloration, a condition called jaundice in its extreme form, and the distinctive smell associated with hepatic failure. But there may have been another factor at play: poisoning. Several contemporary sources hint at the possibility that Mary was being slowly poisoned, possibly by supporters of her half-sister Elizabeth who were eager to see the Protestant princess on the throne. The symptoms Mary exhibited, the skin discoloration, the abdominal pain, the neurological episodes, are consistent with certain types of heavy metal poisoning that were well known to Renaissance assassins. Whether Mary was dying from natural causes or from deliberate poisoning, one thing was clear: the Queen's body was failing catastrophically, and there was nothing her physicians could do to stop it. As Mary Tudor's condition worsened throughout the autumn of 1558, a strange conspiracy of silence descended upon the English court. Despite the Queen's obviously deteriorating health, no official announcements were made about her condition. Instead, a carefully orchestrated campaign of deception was launched to maintain the illusion that Mary remained healthy and in control. This deception was born of political necessity. England's enemies, particularly France, were watching for any sign of weakness that might provide an opportunity for invasion. Mary's own nobles were increasingly restless, with many secretly corresponding with Elizabeth Tudor about the coming transition of power. Most dangerous of all, the common people were growing bolder in their resistance to Mary's religious policies, and news of the Queen's failing health might spark open rebellion. So an elaborate charade was constructed. Mary continued to appear at court functions, but observers noted that she seemed to rely heavily on cosmetics to hide her increasingly sallow complexion. She spoke less frequently, and when she did speak, her voice was often hoarse and strained. Most tellingly, she began to appear only at carefully choreographed events where the lighting was dim and the audience was composed entirely of loyal supporters. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was far more disturbing. Mary's personal servants were sworn to secrecy about what they witnessed in the Queen's private chambers. According to later testimonies, Mary would often collapse as soon as she was out of public view, overcome by pain and exhaustion. Her blackened skin had begun to crack and bleed in places, and the smell emanating from her body had become so strong that her chambers had to be fumigated daily with incense and herbs. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, Mary seemed to be aware that she was dying but refused to accept it. She continued to speak of plans for the future, of the Catholic restoration that would outlive her, of the children she might still bear if God willed it. This denial wasn't simply royal stubbornness. It was the desperate hope of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her beliefs and couldn't bear the thought that her life's work might die with her. The conspiracy of silence extended even to Mary's physicians, who were forbidden from discussing their true assessment of the Queen's condition with anyone outside her immediate circle. This medical secrecy would have tragic consequences, as it prevented any real attempt to treat Mary's condition or even to make her final days more comfortable. Instead, as autumn turned to winter, Mary Tudor was left to face her horrific end largely alone, surrounded by courtiers who were already mentally preparing for Elizabeth's reign, while maintaining the fiction that their queen would recover. November 1558 brought with it the first snows of winter, and with them the final collapse of Mary Tudor's body. The Queen, who had once terrorized England with her religious fervor, was now confined to her bed, her body racked with pain and her mind increasingly clouded by the toxins her failing organs could no longer filter from her blood. The physical transformation was now complete and horrifying to behold. Mary's skin had turned completely black in many places, with a texture that witnesses described as resembling leather that had been left too long in the sun. Her face was so swollen that her eyes were reduced to mere slits, and her lips had cracked and split, oozing a dark fluid that stained her bedclothes. The smell that had been merely unpleasant weeks earlier had now become so overwhelming that even her most loyal servants had to cover their faces with perfumed cloths to remain in her presence. But perhaps most tragic of all was Mary's mental state. The Queen seemed to exist in a twilight world between consciousness and delirium. She would sometimes speak lucidly about affairs of state, only to suddenly begin raving about Protestant conspiracies or phantom armies marching on London. Most painfully, she frequently spoke to her dead mother, Catherine of Aragon, as if the former queen were standing beside her bed offering comfort and guidance. On November 10th, Mary experienced what her physicians believed was a stroke. She lost the ability to speak clearly, and the left side of her body became partially paralyzed. Yet even in this condition, she continued to insist on conducting royal business, using hand gestures and whispered words to communicate her wishes to her increasingly desperate counselors. The end came slowly and agonizingly. For the final week of her life, Mary drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing becoming increasingly labored and irregular. The blackened skin on her arms and legs had begun to crack open, releasing a putrid discharge that her physicians were powerless to treat. Modern medical experts believe she was likely suffering from complete organ failure, with her liver, kidneys, and possibly her heart all shutting down simultaneously. On the night of November 16th, Mary's condition took a final turn for the worse. She began vomiting a dark, tar-like substance that contemporary witnesses described as looking like the very essence of corruption itself. Her body temperature soared, then plummeted, and she began experiencing violent convulsions that left her exhausted and barely conscious. As dawn broke on November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor, the first crowned Queen of England, the woman who had burned hundreds of her subjects in God's name, the monarch who had tried to drag her nation back to medieval Catholicism, drew her final, agonized breath. She was 42 years old. In the immediate aftermath of Mary Tudor's death, her counselors faced an unprecedented crisis. How do you explain to a nation and to the world that your queen died in such a grotesque and horrifying manner? How do you prevent such a death from being seen as divine judgment against the Catholic Restoration? The answer was a carefully orchestrated cover-up that began within hours of Mary's death. The official cause of death was listed simply as fever, a convenient catch-all diagnosis that revealed nothing about the true horror of Mary's final weeks. Her body was immediately wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, soaked in perfumes and preservatives, not just to prepare it for burial, but to contain the overwhelming stench that had made her final days unbearable for those around her. More significantly, access to Mary's body was strictly limited. Unlike previous royal deaths, where the monarch's body would lie in state for the public to pay their respects, Mary's corpse was quickly sealed in a lead-lined coffin and placed in a secure location where only the highest-ranking nobles were permitted to view it, and then only briefly. The official accounts of Mary's death, written by court historians and religious officials, painted a picture of a pious queen who died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loving subjects and secure in her faith. These sanitized versions made no mention of the blackened skin, the putrid smell, or the agonizing pain that characterized Mary's final weeks. But the truth had a way of seeping out, despite official efforts to contain it. Servants who had witnessed Mary's deterioration began whispering to their families and friends about what they had seen. Foreign ambassadors, who had been carefully kept away from the Queen during her final illness, began piecing together reports from their spies and informants. Most damaging of all, some of Mary's own physicians, bound by conscience if not by oath, began sharing carefully worded accounts of their patient's condition with trusted colleagues. Within months of Mary's death, rumors were circulating throughout Europe about the rotting queen who had died in divine punishment for her cruelties. Protestant preachers seized upon these accounts as proof that God had judged Mary and found her wanting. Catholic officials, meanwhile, worked desperately to suppress such stories, arguing that they were Protestant propaganda designed to discredit the late Queen's holy mission. The cover-up was partially successful. Official histories of Mary's reign would continue to describe her death in euphemistic terms for centuries. But the true story of her horrific final days lived on in whispered accounts, private letters, and the traumatized memories of those who had witnessed the death of England's most controversial queen. For more than 4 centuries, the true cause of Mary Tudor's horrific death remained a mystery that fascinated historians and medical experts alike. The official records provided no real clues, and the sanitized accounts of her final illness seemed designed more to protect reputations than to preserve medical truth. It wasn't until the late 20th century that medical historians began to piece together a more complete picture of what actually killed England's first queen regnant. The key breakthrough came from a careful analysis of contemporary accounts that had been dismissed by earlier historians as either exaggerated or completely fictitious. When these descriptions were evaluated by modern physicians familiar with autoimmune diseases and toxic exposure, a clearer picture began to emerge. Mary Tudor was almost certainly suffering from what we now know as autoimmune hepatitis, a condition where the body's immune system attacks the liver, causing progressive and ultimately fatal damage. This would explain the gradual onset of her symptoms, the dramatic skin discoloration, severe jaundice, and the distinctive smell associated with liver failure. But there was likely a second factor at play: heavy metal poisoning. Analysis of hair samples from other Tudor-era figures has revealed surprisingly high levels of lead, mercury, and other toxic substances that were common in 16th century cosmetics, medicines, and even eating utensils. Mary, as queen, would have been exposed to higher concentrations of these toxins than most of her subjects, particularly through the lead-based cosmetics she used to maintain her royal appearance and the mercury-based treatments her physicians prescribed for her various ailments. The combination of autoimmune disease and chronic toxic exposure would have created a perfect storm of physiological breakdown. Mary's immune system was already attacking her liver, and the additional burden of processing heavy metals would have accelerated the organ's failure dramatically. This medical explanation doesn't diminish the horror of Mary's final weeks, but it does provide a rational explanation for what contemporary witnesses saw as divine retribution. The Queen's death wasn't supernatural punishment. It was the tragic result of 16th century medicine's ignorance about autoimmune diseases and the hidden dangers of everyday toxins. Ironically, the very cosmetics and treatments Mary used to maintain her royal dignity may have contributed to her agonizing end. In the weeks and months following Mary Tudor's death, her half-sister Elizabeth moved quickly to consolidate power and reverse the Catholic restoration that had defined the previous 5 years. But Elizabeth's supporters faced a delicate political challenge: how to discredit Mary's reign without seeming to celebrate the death of a fellow Tudor. The solution was to allow the story of Mary's horrific final illness to spread naturally, while carefully shaping the narrative to serve Protestant interests. The whispered accounts of Mary's blackened skin and putrid smell were too vivid and too widespread to suppress entirely. Instead of trying to deny these stories, Elizabeth's propagandists began to frame them as evidence of divine judgment against Catholic persecution. Protestant preachers throughout England began incorporating Mary's death into their sermons, using it as proof that God opposed the burning of heretics. This propaganda campaign was remarkably effective. Within a generation, the story of Bloody Mary's rotting death had become firmly established in Protestant folklore. Popular ballads described the Queen's final agony in gruesome detail, while pamphlets compared her death to the biblical accounts of tyrants who were struck down by divine wrath. The more horrifying the descriptions became, the more they served to validate Elizabeth's Protestant settlement and discredit any future attempts at Catholic restoration. Catholic writers, meanwhile, found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't deny the accounts of Mary's death without seeming to accuse multiple witnesses of lying, but they also couldn't acknowledge the truth without appearing to admit that God had indeed judged their champion and found her wanting. The result was a historical narrative that emphasized Mary's religious extremism while largely ignoring the personal tragedies and political pressures that had shaped her reign. The woman who had suffered through years of illegitimacy, family dysfunction, and political instability was reduced to a caricature. A bloodthirsty fanatic whose gruesome death proved the righteousness of the Protestant cause. This propaganda legacy would prove remarkably durable, shaping how Mary Tudor was remembered for centuries to come. Mary Tudor's death was as lonely and tragic as her life had been tumultuous and controversial. The woman who had fought so desperately to restore England to what she saw as religious truth died in agony, her body betrayed by forces she couldn't understand and her legacy already being shaped by enemies who saw her death as divine vindication of their cause. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Mary's story isn't how she died, but how completely her death overshadowed any possibility of understanding the complex woman behind the crown. Mary Tudor was not simply the bloodthirsty tyrant of Protestant propaganda, nor was she the saintly martyr of Catholic hagiography. She was a deeply damaged woman who had endured a childhood of emotional abuse, political uncertainty, and religious confusion. Her mother's marriage had been declared invalid, making Mary herself illegitimate in the eyes of many. She had watched her father, Henry VIII, execute two of his wives and terrorize the realm in pursuit of a male heir. She had lived through the radical Protestant reforms of her half-brother Edward's reign, seeing everything her mother had died for seemingly swept away. When Mary finally gained the throne at age 37, she was already a woman shaped by trauma, loss, and an overwhelming sense that she had been chosen by God to restore England to the true faith. The phantom pregnancy that broke her spirit was simply the final blow in a lifetime of disappointments and betrayals. The religious persecution that earned Mary her bloody nickname wasn't born of sadistic cruelty, but of desperate conviction. She genuinely believed that allowing heresy to flourish would damn not just individual souls, but the entire nation. Each execution was, in her mind, a necessary sacrifice to save England from eternal punishment. This doesn't excuse the brutality of Mary's reign, but it does help explain how a woman who was described by contemporaries as naturally kind and gentle could order the deaths of nearly 300 of her subjects. She was a broken person wielding absolute power in service of an absolute belief, a combination that inevitably leads to tragedy. Mary's horrific death, the blackened skin, the putrid smell, the agonizing deterioration, became a symbol of divine justice to her enemies and a source of eternal embarrassment to her supporters. But for the historian trying to understand the full scope of the Tudor dynasty, her death represents something else entirely. The final chapter in one of the most psychologically complex and personally tragic stories in English royal history. The queen who died blackened and alone was the same woman who had once danced with her father as a child, who had comforted her heartbroken mother through years of exile, who had risked everything to claim a throne that was rightfully hers. The rot that consumed her body in her final weeks was perhaps a physical manifestation of the spiritual and emotional decay that had been eating away at her for decades. Mary Tudor ruled for just 5 years, but the manner of her death ensured that she would be remembered forever, not as the complex, tragic figure she actually was, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the inevitable fate of those who oppose what history would judge to be progress. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting epitaph for England's first queen regnant. She died as she had lived, misunderstood by her enemies, abandoned by her friends, and absolutely convinced that she was serving a higher purpose that no one else could see. The crown passed to Elizabeth, England became Protestant once again, and Mary Tudor's rotting death became just another weapon in the endless war between competing versions of Christian truth. But for those who took the time to look beyond the propaganda and the horror, Mary's story remained what it had always been. A profoundly human tragedy played out on the stage of history, with consequences that echoed far beyond the woman who paid the ultimate price for her convictions. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.